West Australian Premier Mark McGowan has set stricter border controls, with New South Wales becoming the first jurisdiction in Australia to ask travellers for proof of vaccination.
Well, anyone entering WA from New South Wales will have to show proof that they have received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine and returned a negative test 72 hours before. Now, for more, let's bring in our politician panel. We're joined by Liberal MP Trent Zimmerman. We're also joined by Labor MP Josh Wilson. Good morning to both of you. Josh, I might start with you with this new rule from WA. Now, we've had all states and territories agree to the Doherty modelling, looking at the 70 and 80% of vaccinations before we sort of move through those phases. But in New South Wales, the Premier has alluded to the possibility of a limited number of restrictions relaxing in areas where there are low numbers of COVID cases and high rates of vaccinations. Do you think, from your WA perspective, that New South Wales is branching off on its own a bit here from where the rest of the country is at?
Well, good morning, Joe, Fauzier and Trent. I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to say. There are different messages come out in the press conferences day by day. It seems that there is national agreement around those kinds of thresholds that we need to reach with the vaccine program in Australia, which is not going as it should, and we're not in the position that we should be in. But one thing's for sure is we need to be consistent in setting and then meeting those kinds of benchmarks. I don't think there's any reason why we'd be expecting in New South Wales or anywhere else that you could somehow start to depart from that. The task in New South Wales clearly is to get on top of the Delta variant outbreak at the moment, which is not looking very good. So I think it's extremely premature to be talking about lifting restrictions at all, let alone at benchmarks that sit under those kinds of national targets. The problem is we're a long way from those national targets, and that's because the vaccine rollout has been incompetently administered.
Trent Zimmerman, what's your take on this? Are we seeing, New South Wales is now focusing on the fact that they're trying to ramp up the vaccination numbers in the state, whereas the rest of the country seems to be going for zero COVID cases. Are we seeing a divergence here?
Well, good morning to you all, first of all. Look, I think there are a couple of issues in that. Firstly, I think it is important that we continue to have the 70 and 80% full vaccination thresholds as the key determinant about when we're going to see life return to some kind of normality. And my understanding is that that's certainly the New South Wales Premier's position. She's not talking about moving to phase B, as we call it, until we reach that 70% threshold. And I do think that's really important. And the second thing I would say is that we do have to focus on making the lockdown in Sydney and New South Wales work. It is going to be the most important thing that we do, because whilst the Delta strain is obviously posing huge challenges for Australia and countries around the world, that we're still in that phase of the National Cabinet program where we have to focus on suppression, and we've just got to make this lockdown work.
Trent, what scope is there for the federal government to have influence on the measures in place in New South Wales?
Well, I'd like to think that there's a close liaison between the Premier and the Prime Minister, and certainly the PM said yesterday after another National Cabinet meeting that the Premier had made it quite clear that Phase B in New South Wales wasn't starting prematurely, and I think that's really important. But obviously the individual health orders that are put in place by the states are decisions that they make under their constitutional powers. So I think it's important that we're working closely with New South Wales, but at the end of the day, those decisions do rest with state governments.
Josh Wilson, the WA Premier, Mark McGowan, has been very critical of New South Wales' handling of the recent outbreak in the state. And you a little earlier said that the reason the country is being held back is because of the failure of the vaccination rollout. And yet, WA is lagging when it comes to vaccination numbers. Why is that?
Well, I think that's a bit of an interesting reading of the way that all of the states and territories are packed together and making progress towards an acceptable level of vaccines. The truth is, it is a race. The Prime Minister didn't want to acknowledge that for a long time. He acknowledges it now. It is a race, and we all need to get across that line as soon as possible. Now, if we all cross the line in a bunch and South Australia happens to be a fraction ahead of WA, that won't really matter. In Western Australia, to some degree, the enthusiasm and motivation, I suppose, for uptake of the vaccine perhaps hasn't been there to the same degree as in other jurisdictions, because we've managed the spread of infection better. But that goes to the larger problem. The larger problem is that we're way behind where we should be. We squandered this opportunity that we had through our effective first 12 months of response, when border controls and state and territory health measures and the forbearance and discipline of the Australian people put us in this great position. We're now a long way behind at barely 20% of the population, 35th out of 38 OECD countries, and a big task ahead of us. We shouldn't be in this position. We should have had a greater supply, and we should have had a public information campaign and better logistical management from the federal government. But that's the task that we have before us, and we all need to get on with that.
Well, Trent, the Prime Minister has been saying this week, it doesn't matter how you start the race, it matters how you finish the race. But if we'd started this race better, then we would be in a better position today, wouldn't we? It does matter how you start the race.
Oh, look, I think there's no doubt that the vaccine program had its problems and challenges early on, and they were very difficult, and things like suddenly having 3 million doses that we expected not arrive was a big problem.
So it does matter how you start a race then.
The changing health advice has been a big problem, but I think that we have been able to proceed nonetheless because of one crucial decision, and that was to invest in the Australian manufacturer of vaccines through AstraZeneca. And if you look at us, say, compared to our friends across the ditch in New Zealand, who have been entirely reliant on overseas supplies, the reason that we're ahead of New Zealand is because we did have that AstraZeneca capacity on our own shores. But it is a highly constrained environment globally. We know that. It's everyone wants a vaccine, and understandably, a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies have focused on those countries, either where they're based or where there have been larger and more significant outbreaks. But look, I think what is really important is that the vaccine program is really hitting its strides now. I mean, just in the last 4 days, to see 1 million doses issued is just exactly where we need to be. And we know that on top of the AstraZeneca being made here, we do have good supplies of Pfizer, and next month starting the Moderna rollout as well. So we are very confident that we'll get to the 70% mark before the end of the year, maybe even the 80% mark. In my state, the Premier's current predictions is that we'll get to 70% full vaccination sometime in October and 80% in November. So that is the type of outcomes that we need to see, and we just need Australians to keep up their extraordinary effort over the last couple of weeks as vaccines have become available, and keep going, because it is the most important thing that we can do to protect ourselves, but also to do it for Australia, because it is our pathway back to some type of normal existence.
Part of the efforts to try to keep people, and particularly those who may be infected, to keep them at home is this introduction of stay-at-home payments. Now, Victoria has had that for quite some time. New South Wales has only introduced that just yesterday. But Josh Wilson, unions are now calling for National Cabinet to make this paid isolation and testing a universal right for all workers. Should it be across the board, Josh Wilson?
Well, it goes to the question of how you really achieve the sort of vaccination levels that we need. And as I've said before, I mean, we know that the biggest problem was lack of supply, which should never have been the situation Australia was in. But then the other elements are public information and encouragement around the vaccine, and the logistical and other practical arrangements. And some of those in relation to people who are working, need time off in order to get a vaccine, may not have those arrangements. If they're a casual, it's sort of essentially on them. May also need some time if there are side effects that affect them for a day or two. All of these things go to that issue of the administrative competence in the logistical aspects of the vaccine rollout. And that could all and should all have been done much better. And one of the things we have to confront here in Australia is that if there's no responsibility for incompetence, if there's no accountability taken for incompetence, then incompetence will continue. We should have been better prepared for the bushfires. We weren't. We should be in a much better position with a vaccine rollout. We should be in a much better position when it comes to climate change and renewable energy in this country, and we're not, because we have a government that doesn't take responsibility for its job, which is national leadership.
That being the case, Trent Zimmerman, do you think after all the challenges that we've been through now, after all the tweaks and changes that we've had in terms of financial support, in terms of the vaccine rollout, are we prepared for the next onslaught of a new variant?
Well, the challenge with this awful virus is that we can't control its course, and the Delta strain has undoubtedly thrown up a new curveball, which the whole world is trying to readjust to. But I think what is important is that we know that, based on everything that we do know, that the vaccinations that we have available do provide good protection. And I thought that the Chief Medical Officer's presentation yesterday was a really good demonstration of the fact, where he showed that if you look at the waves that Australia has had, for example, the death rate last year in the second wave compared to that which we're experiencing at the moment was so much greater last year, because the vaccines are working at protecting the most vulnerable. And that's why also that we're obviously looking ahead in terms of the booster strategy, and we now have those 80 million doses of Pfizer that will support the booster strategy next year, and in the year after we've got Novavax coming. But obviously, the whole international scientific community is working on making sure that our vaccines, and particularly those boosters, do continue to provide that good protection.
On that note, we're going to have to leave our discussion there. Thank you so much to both of you, Trent Zimmerman as well as Josh Wilson, for joining us on Weekend Breakfast.
Thanks. And thanks, Josh, for getting up so early.
Thanks.
Yes, hello to all our WA viewers.